Have you ever stopped to wonder why an entire generation, the ones born roughly between 1965 and 1980, grew up feeling like they were raised by wolves instead of parents, like they were thrown into the deep end of life with no one watching the pool? What if I told you that the people who were supposed to protect them, guide them, and love them unconditionally were the very same generation that decided selfishness was a virtue, that kicking an 18-year-old out with nothing but a duffel bag and a good luck was tough love, and that family was something you only tolerated on major holidays? Stay with me until the very end, because by the time we're done here, you're going to see exactly why so many Gen Xers still carry invisible scars, why they say, I don't care, like it's a badge of honor, and why a shocking number of them look at the baby boomers and feel nothing but cold, quiet contempt. You're not going to want to miss what's coming, trust me. If you're enjoying this kind of no filter breakdown of how we got to this point in society, do me a massive favor right now. Smash that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, hit subscribe, and most importantly, click the notification bell and select all so you never miss a single upload the second it drops. This is angry guy content, raw, real, and delivered straight with no sugarcoating. Also, if you're serious about protecting everything you've worked for and actually growing real wealth in this chaotic financial landscape, go check out Angry's Crypto Academy right now. We teach you step by step how to buy, sell, trade, and most importantly, keep your assets safe from the people who keep proving they can't be trusted with power. The link is in the description. Click it. Join thousands of us who decided to stop being victims of the system and start building something the old guard can't touch. And if these videos are hitting home for you, if they're waking something up inside that's been asleep for way too long, consider buying me a Red Bull through the link below. It keeps the lights on and the caffeine flowing so I can keep bringing you the truth they don't want on your screen. Let's get into it. Picture this. It's the summer of 1978. A 10-year-old kid rides his bike 3 miles across town to a friend's house because nobody is home to drive him, and nobody really cares where he is as long as he's back before the streetlights come on. That same kid has a house key dangling from a piece of yarn around his neck because both parents work. Or maybe only one parent is even in the picture anymore, and Latchkey Kid became the official title for an entire age group. The refrigerator has a note that says, dinner money on the counter, next to a $5 bill, which in 1978 could actually buy a couple of Happy Meals and still leave change for the arcade. That freedom sounds almost mythical to anyone raised after the year 2000, but freedom came with a shadow that nobody really talked about until decades later. Because while that kid was out experiencing the last era of true unsupervised childhood, a whole lot of terrible things were also happening that no child should ever have to see or live through or survive. And the people who were supposed to be the guardrails, the safety net, the adults in the room were the baby boomers, the very same generation that preached peace and love in the 60s, then turned around and decided that parenting was an inconvenience, standing between them and their new waterbed, their new muscle car, their new divorce, their new life where kids were optional accessories at best and outright burdens at worst. Let that sink in for a second. The generation that sang about teaching your children well turned around and taught an entire cohort of kids that they were on their own the moment they could fog a mirror, and the statistics back this up in ways that should make every boomer watching this feel something that resembles shame, even if I know most of them are physiologically incapable of it. In the 1970s, the, the divorce rate in America absolutely exploded. We're talking about a 100% increase from the decade before. By 1979, one out of every two marriages was ending in divorce. And who do you think bore the brunt of that social experiment? Gen X kids. Suddenly, millions of children went from two-parent households to single-mother households almost overnight, because back then it was almost always the mother who got custody, while the father got visitation every other weekend, and a new girlfriend who was only a few years older than the kids she was now expected to tolerate. Stability? Gone. Consistent rules? Gone. Someone who actually had the time and emotional bandwidth to notice whether you came home with unexplained bruises or whether you stopped talking for 3 days straight. Good luck. And the parenting style that the boomers brought to the table when they actually were around can only be described as authoritarian neglect. Think about that phrase for a second, authoritarian neglect. It's the worst of both worlds. You had parents who would ground you for 2 months because you left a bicycle in the driveway, but those same parents wouldn't notice if you didn't come home until 2 a.m. on a school night. Rules were arbitrary, punishment was harsh and often physical, but actual supervision, actual interest, actual guidance, almost non existent. Do as I say, not as I do, wasn't just a cliche, it was the entire operating manual. I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine growing up in a home where the emotional temperature swings between icy indifference and sudden explosive rage, with no warning and no in between. One day, your parent doesn't even look up from the TV to acknowledge that you exist. The next day, the same parent is screaming in your face because you forgot to take out the trash. That wasn't rare. That was Tuesday for millions of Gen X kids. And because nobody was modeling emotional regulation, nobody was teaching coping skills, nobody was saying, I see you're hurting, let's talk about it. Those kids learned the only survival strategy available: shut it down, stuff it deep, and pretend you don't feel anything, because showing pain just gave the adults another reason to mock you or hit you or tell you to toughen up. And then, right on schedule, the moment the calendar flipped to your 18th birthday, the same parents who had barely spoken a kind word to you in a decade suddenly turned into drill sergeants. You're an adult now. Get out. I cannot tell you how many Gen Xers have told me the exact same story. Graduation day in June, suitcase on the porch by August, sometime sooner. No safety net, no college fund, no stay until you're on your feet. Just, I raised you, my job is done. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. For thousands of years of human history, multi generational households were the norm. Adult children lived with parents until marriage. And even after marriage, it was common for grandparents, parents, and kids to be under the same roof, sharing resources, sharing wisdom, sharing protection. The boomers looked at that tradition, thousands of years old, and said, nah, I want the house to myself so I can crank the stereo and bang my new spouse without teenagers in the next room. And just like that, an entire social contract that had held civilizations together was thrown in the trash because Karen wanted to do yoga in the living room without anyone judging her leotard. That abandonment at 18 wasn't just cold, it was a cultural rupture. And the message it sent was crystal clear. You were useful only as long as the state forced us to keep you. The second that legal obligation disappeared, so did you. Imagine internalizing that at 18 years old. Imagine being told explicitly or implicitly that the people who brought you into the world tolerated you only because a judge would have taken the house if they didn't. That does something to a person. It creates a generation that struggles to trust love, that expects abandonment as the default setting of every relationship, that learned very early that the only person you can actually count on is yourself, because the people who were biologically hardwired to protect you chose disco and divorce papers instead. And here's the part that still makes my blood boil when I really think about it. While boomer parents were telling their kids to hit the road at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a bus pass, those same parents had been handed the keys to the greatest economic expansion in human history. They bought houses for the price of a used car today. They got union jobs straight out of high school that paid enough to support a family of five. They went to college on government grants that cost less than one semester costs now. And then, the moment their own kids reached adulthood, they pulled the ladder up behind them. Tuition skyrocketed, wages stagnated, houses became investment vehicles instead of homes, and the official boomer response was, figure it out, we did. Except they didn't have to figure out anything close to what Gen X faced because the entire economic structure had been dismantled to enrich the very people now telling their kids to stop being entitled. But it wasn't just the abandonment. It wasn't just the divorce epidemic. It wasn't just the economic betrayal. It was the sheer level of danger that Gen X kids were casually exposed to because nobody was paying attention. Think about the things we now consider absolute horrors that were just Tuesday afternoon in the 1970s and 80s. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Kids accepting rides from strangers because they missed the last bus home. Predators who hung around arcades and roller rinks knowing no parent was coming to pick anyone up for hours. Drunk drivers everywhere because DUI laws were basically suggestions before MAD got organized in the early 80s. And who do you think were in the cars with those drunk drivers? That's right, the same kids whose parents were at the bar or at their second job or on a date with someone who definitely wasn't your new step parent yet. And then there were the ones who didn't make it home. Every Gen Xer I know can rattle off a list of classmates who died long before graduation, car accidents, overdoses that started with pills from their own parents' medicine cabinets, swimming pool accidents, firearms left loaded on the nightstand because kids know better than to touch it, and on and on. Those deaths weren't rare anomalies. They were so common that schools had grief counselors on speed dial, and most towns had a designated memorial tree on the high school lawn with way too many plaques nailed to it. And every single one of those tragedies had the same root cause. Adult supervision was optional, and the adults opted out. The result? A generation that learned to survive by becoming numb. You hear Gen Xers say whatever and I don't care, and you might think it's just attitude. It's not, it's armor. When you've watched friends die, when you've been abandoned, when you've been told in 1,000 different ways that your pain is inconvenient, the only way to keep walking forward is to shut the valve on feeling anything too deeply. Because if you actually let yourself feel the full weight of what happened, you would collapse under it. So you don't. You develop a dark sense of humor. You master sarcasm before you master long division. You decide that caring is a luxury you can't afford. Because the last time you cared deeply about something or someone, it got ripped away or it left on its own the minute it was legally allowed to. That numbness, that survivor mentality, it made Gen X tough, no question. They are the generation that can MacGyver a solution out of duct tape and spite. They are the ones who lived through recessions, wars, AIDS, crack, grunge, and the complete collapse of every institution they were told to trust, and they just kept going. But toughness extracted a price. Decades later, in their 40s and 50s, many of them are finally unpacking the trauma they never had language for as kids, the anxiety that feels like background radiation, the hyper independence that makes real intimacy terrifying, the quiet rage that flares up when someone says, respect your elders. Because the elders they knew didn't earn respect, they demanded it while giving nothing back. And here we are, watching the same generation that broke the family, broke the economy, broke the social contract, now sitting on piles of unearned wealth, voting to make sure nobody else gets the benefits they got, and still having the nerve to call everyone else entitled. The irony would be hilarious if it wasn't so infuriating. We're only getting started. There's so much more to unpack here. The specific ways the neglect manifested, the cultural artifacts that prove how little anyone was watching, the long-term fallout we're still living through today as a society. Stick around because the next part is going to hit even harder. The neglect wasn't just emotional or financial, it was physical in ways that would get Child Protective Services called today before the sun went down. Think about the average 1982 backyard, above ground pool with no fence, no lock on the gate, and a diving board that was basically a concussion waiting to happen. a rusty swing set that hadn't seen a bolt tighten since Nixon was president, a garage full of lawnmower gas, paint thinner, and asbestos shingles stacked right next to the big wheels and skateboards. Parents thought nothing of letting 8-year-olds mix gasolines and matches to make experiments in the driveway because boys will be boys and they have to learn somehow. The local news ran a body count every summer. Little Johnny drowned. Little Susie fell off the monkey bars and cracked her skull. Little Timmy drank antifreeze because it was in a Pepsi bottle under the sink. And every single time, the parent would cry on camera and say, I only looked away for a second, except it wasn't a second, it was 6 hours while they were inside watching soap operas and smoking Virginia Slims. And don't get me started on the vans. Every town had at least one panel van with no back windows, shag carpet, and a wizard airbrushed on the side. Those things rolled through neighborhoods like ice cream trucks for predators. And kids were told, don't talk to strangers, while simultaneously being sent to the corner store alone with a note that said, please give my son a pack of Marlboro Reds. He has the money. The contradiction never even registered to the adults. Stranger danger was a phrase that existed, but it was treated like a suggestion, not a rule. How many Gen Xers have that one story they only tell in whispers about the creepy guy who offered them a ride, or the neighbor who invited them in to see puppies, and something felt wrong, but they were too little to know why they should run? A lot. More than any of us want to admit out loud. Then there were the schools. Metal detectors weren't a thing yet, but fights that left kids with broken jaws happened in the parking lot every Friday. Teachers smoked in the faculty lounge and sometimes in the hallway between classes. The vice principal carried a paddle the size of a canoe oar and used it freely because spare the rod, spoil the child was still gospel. Bullying wasn't a crisis, it was character building. If you came home with a black eye, the question wasn't who did this, it was what did you do to deserve it? And if you were the quiet kid, the weird kid, the kid who didn't have the right clothes because your mom was working 2 jobs and child support was a fantasy, you learned to make yourself small or make yourself scary because there was no third option. Home wasn't necessarily safer. Domestic violence was still considered a private family matter. Police would show up to a house where a kid was hiding under the bed while dad threw mom through a wall, and the cops would tell the dad to take a walk around the block and cool off. Half the time, the kid got taken to a relative's house for the night, and the other half the time, the cop just left and the beating continued after the cruiser pulled away. Gen X grew up knowing exactly what the sound of a fist hitting a face sounded like, and they grew up knowing that telling anyone only made it worse. And yet, somehow, the same parents who couldn't be bothered to lock up the .38 revolver in the nightstand drawer expected their 12-year-old to babysit the younger siblings from 3 p.m. until midnight because they wanted to go line dancing at the VFW. 12-year-olds were raising toddlers while the adults chased whatever made them feel young again. Diapers, dinner, homework, bedtime, all on the kid who still had to get himself up for school the next morning because the parent rolled in at 2 a.m., smelling like tequila and someone else's cologne. That wasn't rare. That was half of Gen X's childhood resume. The cultural artifacts from that era are almost comical in how perfectly they capture the negligence. Remember those public service announcements that were basically, we know your parents aren't watching, so here's a celebrity telling you not to set the house on fire with your chemistry set. McGruff, the crime dog, wasn't talking to parents. He was talking directly to 8-year-olds because the parents were at work or at the bar or at their new boyfriend's apartment. The It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are spot that ran on late night TV wasn't aimed at the kids watching it. It was aimed at the parents who were out and had completely forgotten they even had children. Even the toys were death traps. Lawn darts, actual metal spears you threw at the ground while your cousin stood nearby. Clackers, 2 glass balls on a string that shattered into razor sharp shards the second you got good at them. Easy bake ovens that ran on 100-watt incandescent bulbs hot enough to blister your arm if you reached in too fast. And every Christmas, there was at least one news story about a kid who swallowed a toy part and choked because the age label said 3 plus, and the parents figured that meant safe for infants. The Consumer Product Safety Commission was basically invented because Gen X kept dying in ways that made regulators go pale. And cars. Good Lord, the cars. No seatbelt laws in most states until the late 80s. Kids riding in the back of pickup trucks like it was a hayride. Station wagons with the rear facing third seat where kids waved at the traffic behind them while mom smoked with the window cracked 2 inches. Car seats? Those were for babies. And even then, they were plastic buckets with a metal bar that would have turned any kid into a projectile in a 30-mile-an-hour crash. Airbags didn't exist. Lap belts were optional, and drunk driving was so common that every Gen Xer knows the smell of a parent trying to hide beer breath with Banaka before picking them up from soccer practice. The result was a childhood attrition rate that reads like a war documentary. Between 1970 and 1990, the child mortality rate from accidents was double what it is today, and that's with a smaller population. Gen X didn't just lose a friend here and there, they lost entire circles. By the time many of them graduated high school, they had been to more funerals than weddings, and every single one of those deaths came with the whispered subtext. If an adult had been paying attention, this wouldn't have happened. So when you hear a Gen Xer shrug and say whatever, when something terrible happens, understand that it's not indifference, it's muscle memory. They have been training since age 6 to expect loss, to expect abandonment, to expect that the people who are supposed to care will choose literally anything else over caring. That shrug is the sound of scar tissue flexing. And the crazy part is that society looked at all of this and decided the answer wasn't to hold the parents accountable. The answer was to take the surviving kids and medicate them. By the late 80s and early 90s, the same kids who had been ignored were now being diagnosed with ADHD and pumped full of Ritalin because they couldn't sit still in class after everything they had lived through. The problem wasn't the trauma, you see. The problem was that the trauma was making them inconvenient to teach. So drug them into compliance and bill the parents who still didn't want to be parents. That's the part that still keeps some Gen Xers awake at night. The realization that the same system that looked away when they were in danger suddenly cared a whole lot when their behavior started reflecting the chaos they were raised in. The same teachers who didn't notice a kid came to school with welts on his back were the first ones to recommend psychiatric evaluation when that kid punched a wall in 8th grade. The same parents who thought feeding a child cereal for dinner 3 nights a week was fine suddenly found the energy to drag that child to a doctor when the school threatened suspension. It wasn't concern, it was liability management. And now, decades later, many Gen Xers are parents themselves, and the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction that they don't know how to land it. They either repeat the hands off approach because it's what they know, or they helicopter so hard their own kids can't tie their shoes without a permission slip. There is no middle ground when your only role models were either absent or explosive. We are living in the fallout of the greatest parenting failure in modern history, and almost nobody talks about it because the people who caused it control the narrative, the wealth, and most of the media. But the evidence is everywhere if you know where to look. It's in the divorce rate that never came back down. It's in the trust issues that define an entire generation. It's in the dark humor, the gallows laughter, the okay boomer dismissal that isn't just a meme, it's a survival reflex. And it's in the quiet moments when a 50-year-old man or woman finally says out loud, for the first time ever, my parents didn't love me, they just didn't. Saying it feels like treason. It feels like betrayal. But it also feels like oxygen after holding your breath for 40 years. We still have a long way to go. Well, the specific cultural moments, the music, the movies, the way Gen X turned their pain into art that still resonates today, the way they became the coolest, most self reliant, most deeply wounded generation anyone ever ignored. There's more to say about the economic theft, the way boomers turned the American dream into a gated community with a sign that says no kids allowed, and how Gen X responded by building their own culture in the cracks. We're barely halfway through this story, and the next pieces are going to cut even deeper. The cultural fallout is where it gets almost poetic because Gen X took everything that was done to them and turned it into the soundtrack, the movies, the fashion, the entire aesthetic that still defines cool 30 years later. They didn't just survive the neglect, they weaponized it. They took the message, nobody cares about you, and answered with, fine, then we will build a world so interesting that nobody can look away. Grunge, hip hop, rave culture, skateboarding, underground comics, indie film, all of it was born in the abandoned lots and empty basements where latchkey kids gathered because nobody was home to tell them to come inside. The irony is thick. The generation that was told they were worthless created the only youth culture that every subsequent generation still copies shamelessly. Think about the music alone. Nirvana's Nevermind didn't come from a happy suburban garage band. It came from a kid who watched his parents divorce, bounced between relatives, slept under bridges, and decided that screaming about how much it hurt was better than pretending it didn't. Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, every major grunge act was singing about abandonment, addiction, suicide, and the specific flavor of rage that comes from realizing the adults who were supposed to save you were the ones who broke you in the first place. Even the poppier stuff, the alternative radio hits, carried the same DNA. The Cure, Depeche Mode, Nine Inch Nails, dark, introspective, sarcastic, and completely uninterested in asking permission from anyone over 30. And the movies. Fight Club isn't just a cult film, it's a Gen X trauma response in cinematic form. Office Space, Reality Bites, Singles, Clerks, every one of them is about people in their 20s and 30s who woke up one day and realized the system their parents sold them on was rigged, that the adults had taken everything and left debt and sarcasm as the only inheritance. The slacker label that got pinned on them wasn't laziness, it was a rational response to being told, work hard, play by the rules, and you'll get what we got, only to watch the rules change the second they showed up to play. They became the kings and queens of irony because sincerity had been beaten out of them early. If you admit you care and then get abandoned again, you look like a fool. So you pretend nothing matters. You wear the flannel shirt with the cigarette burn holes like armor. You quote The Simpsons and Beavis and Butthead the way previous generations quoted scripture because laughing at the apocalypse is easier than crying about it. That dark humor saved them. It still saves them. When you've been to 15 funerals before age 18, you learn to laugh at things that would break other people because the alternative is to lie down and never get up again. The fashion was deliberate anti fashion. Ripped jeans weren't a trend. They were jeans that were actually ripped because nobody was buying you new ones. Doc Martens and combat boots weren't statements. They were the only shoes that lasted when you had to walk everywhere because your parents wouldn't pick you up. The oversized flannel wasn't a look. It was stolen from your dad's closet after he moved out and never came back for his stuff. Everything that became iconic was born from scarcity and figure it out yourself. And then the fashion industry sold it back to the next generations for $500 a shirt. Even the technology story is laced with this same theme. Gen X was the last generation to grow up without the internet and the first to master it as adults. They remember payphones, phone books, and having to call a friend's house and risk talking to their parents. They also built the dot-com boom from nothing, taught themselves HTML in night classes after working retail all day, And then watch the same boomer executives who couldn't work email take all the credit and the stock options. They invented the sharing economy because they had already learned to share everything, sometimes whether they wanted to or not. They are the reason ride sharing apps and couch surfing exist. They spent their 20s figuring out how to sleep on a stranger's floor for free because rent was impossible and their parents' guest room had been converted into a home gym in 1997. And relationships. That's where the damage runs deepest. Gen X has one of the lowest marriage rates and highest divorce rates of any generation since the boomers themselves. Why? Because they watched marriage implode out in real time as kids. They saw what happens when people say, till death do us part, and then bail the second the vibe is off. They learned that love comes with an expiration date, and that the person who says they will always be there is usually packing boxes before the ink on the divorce decree is dry. So a lot of them simply opted out. Better to stay single than to risk creating another broken home. Better to keep it casual than to trust someone with the power to destroy you the way you watched your parents destroy each other. Those who did get married often brought the same emotional programming into it. Hyper independence collides in the worst way when two people who are taught never need anyone try to build a life together. You get couples who love each other but live parallel lives, who would rather die than ask for help, who keep score of who did what and when, because fairness became the substitute for vulnerability. And then you get the ones who swore they would never treat their own kids the way they were treated, so they overcorrect into helicopter parenting or tiger mom intensity, and their own children grow up anxious and unable to handle failure because the one thing their Gen X parents could never teach was how to feel safe being vulnerable. The economic betrayal deserves its own chapter because it's criminal in scope. Boomers entered the workforce when a single income could buy a house, two cars, and a yearly vacation. They paid for college with summer jobs. They got pensions, unions, and lifetime employment. Then, the minute the first Gen Xer graduated high school, all of that vanished. State colleges that used to cost a few $100s a semester became 50,000 a year. Entry-level jobs that used to pay enough to live on became internships that paid nothing and required a master's degree. Houses that sold for $20,000 in 1970 were suddenly $500,000 by 1995. And the down payment assistance programs the boomers had enjoyed were gutted to pay for their tax cuts. And the response from the boomer parents? Crickets, or worse, mockery. When I was your age, I worked 3 jobs and paid my own way. Yeah, Karen, you worked 3 jobs that each paid more than a starting teacher makes today, and your rent was $200 a month. The math never mathed, but they still said it with a straight face while refusing to co-sign a student loan or let their kid move home after graduation because we're turning your old room into a scrapbooking studio. The wealth transfer that's happening right now, the biggest in human history, is almost entirely flowing to boomer heirs who already have trust funds, while the Gen Xers, who took care of those same parents through cancer and dementia and the 2008 crash, are getting left with a stack of medical bills and a house that still has 30 years on the mortgage. It's not just unfair, it's theft dressed up as personal responsibility. And yet, despite all of this, Gen X is the generation that refuses to complain too loudly. They don't want pity. They don't want participation trophies. They just want to be left alone to fix what's broken with the same duct tape and spite that got them this far. That's why you don't see them marching in the streets or writing think pieces about their feelings. They're too busy working the 2 jobs it now takes to pay for one boomer's prescription meds while making sure their own kid doesn't OD on fentanyl, because the opioid epidemic is what happens when an entire generation teaches the next one that pills make the pain stop. They are the forgotten middle child of history, sandwiched between the loudest, most self congratulatory generation that ever lived and the most documented, most emotionally literate generation that came after. And in that sandwich position, they have carried the weight quietly, competently, and with a level of grace that nobody ever gave them credit for. But the bill is coming due. The trauma doesn't stay buried forever. Midlife crisis for Gen X isn't buying a Corvette. It's finally admitting in therapy that the reason you can't sleep is because you still flinch when someone raises their voice. That the reason you work 80 hours a week is because stopping means feeling. That the reason you can't say I love you without it sounding like a question is because nobody ever said it to you and meant it. We are watching an entire generation hit 50 and realize they spent their whole lives proving they didn't need anyone, only to discover that they actually did. And the people they needed most had been gone for decades, emotionally, if not physically. That's the real tragedy here. It's not just that the boomers failed as parents, it's that they created a generation so good at surviving that they never learned how to live. We're getting close to the end now, but there are still a few more layers to peel back. The specific ways Gen X is parenting differently, the quiet revenge they're taking in the workplace, the cultural time bomb still ticking from everything that was swept under the rug. And most importantly, what happens next? Because the story doesn't end with broken people in their 50s drinking themselves to death in silence. There's a reckoning coming, and it's going to be something to see. The reckoning is already starting, and it is quieter than anyone expected, which makes it all the more devastating. Gen X did not take to the streets with pitchforks. They did not write viral manifestos or start crying on TikTok. They simply stopped playing the game the way the rules were handed to them. They walked into middle management, into boardrooms, into hospital admin offices, into every gatekeeping position the boomers are finally too old or too sick to hold on to, and they began changing the locks from the inside. You are watching it happen right now, and you probably did not even notice. It looks like a 52-year-old director who suddenly mandates mental health days and actually enforces them. It looks like a principal who ends the paddling policy the same week she takes the job because she still has the scar on her thigh from 1984. It looks like a nurse manager who refuses to let the hospital schedule 12-hour shifts with no breaks because she remembers her mom coming home from double shifts and crying in the shower. It looks like entire companies quietly rewriting return to office policies because the people writing them spent their childhoods waiting alone in empty houses and swore their own employees would never have to do the same with their kids. The revolution is not being televised. It is being written into HR handbooks and school district policies by people who survived hell and decided nobody else gets to go through it if they can help it. And in their personal lives, the shift is even sharper. A lot of Gen X men looked at the way their fathers treated their mothers, looked at the way their fathers treated them, and said, not my son, not my daughter, never again. They are the dads coaching the soccer team, even though they hate soccer, showing up to every recital, learning how to braid hair from YouTube at 2 a.m. because they remember what it felt like to have nobody in the bleachers. They are the ones who will sit in a parking lot for 20 minutes after work just to make sure their kid gets out of practice safely because they still remember the coach who offered rides home and nobody ever questioned it back then. They are breaking a cycle that is thousands of years old. One bedtime story, one packed lunch, one I'm proud of you at a time, and most of them will never get credit for it because that is not why they are doing it. Gen X women are doing the same thing in ways that are just as fierce. They are the moms who refuse to let their daughters believe their worth is tied to how quiet and pretty they can be. They are the ones teaching their sons that emotions are not weakness and that asking for help is strength. They are the ones who will burn the entire PTA to the ground before they let another child get ignored the way they were. And when their own parents call and complain that the grandchildren are spoiled because they get hugs and boundaries and actual conversations, these women look them dead in the eye and say, good, that was the entire point. That is the quiet revenge. Not screaming, not canceling, just refusing to pass the damage forward. Every time a Gen X parent chooses presence over absence, patience over rage, listening over lecturing, they are dismantling the legacy their own parents left them one brick at a time. And the financial reckoning is coming too. It's our the great wealth transfer everyone keeps talking about is not going to play out the way the financial planners think. A lot of Gen Xers are discovering that the inheritance they were counting on to pay off decades of medical bills and student loans is smaller than advertised, eaten away by reverse mortgages, gambling cruises, and QVC shopping networks. So they are doing what they have always done, to figuring it out themselves. They are the ones who learned crypto in their 40s, who are stacking Bitcoin while their parents still think Venmo is magic. They are the ones moving to lower cost states, building accessory dwelling units in the backyard, and creating the multi generational households their parents mocked them for needing. The circle is completing itself, just not in the way the boomers planned. The ultimate irony is going to be when the same parents who threw their kids out at 18 end up old, sick, broke, and knocking on the door of the child they abandoned, asking for help. And a lot of Gen Xers are going to open that door, not out of guilt, but out of cold, clear eyed choice. Some will take the parent in and care for them with the same efficiency they use to change a carburetor, because that is who they are. Others will hand them a list of assisted living facilities and say, "You taught me self reliance. Congratulations, you are about to experience it." Either way, the power dynamic flips, and for the first time in 50 years, the child gets to decide what family means. That moment is coming for millions of families over the next decade, and it is going to be one of the largest unspoken psychological shifts in history. And here is the part very few people are ready to hear. Gen X is not going to fix everything. They are too scarred, too tired, too cynical for messianic delusions, but they are going to leave the world better than they found it in ways that will not make the headlines. They are going to be the last generation that knows how to fix a car with a coat hanger, and the first generation that normalizes therapy for men. They are going to be the bridge between analog and digital, between pull yourself up by your bootstraps and it is okay to not be okay. They are going to parent with a ferocity their own parents never understood. And when they die, they will leave behind children who never had to learn numbness as a survival skill. That is the real legacy. Not the music, not the movies, not the sarcasm that keeps the pain at arm's length. The legacy is the day some Gen X parent looks at their own teenager after a fight and says, "I messed up. I'm sorry. Let's talk about it," and means it. That sentence, spoken millions of times in millions of homes, is the sound of a chain breaking that started rattling the day a boomer decided parenthood was a phase you outgrow. So when you see a Gen Xer staring off into space at a cookout, drink in hand, quiet while everyone else argues about politics, understand they are probably running an inventory of every person they lost before age 20, every scar they never told anyone about, every promise they made to themselves in an empty house at age 12 that they have spent their entire adult life keeping. They are not checked out. They are counting exits and making sure everyone they love is safe, because nobody ever did it for them and they decided that ends now. And if you are one of them, if you are sitting there watching this and something in your chest just cracked open a little, hear me clearly. It was never your fault. The neglect was not tough love. The abandonment was not character building. The silence was not normal. You were a child, and the adults who were supposed to protect you chose themselves instead. That is on them. Every single day you get up and choose to be better than what was modeled for you is a victory they will never get to claim. You survived their worst. Now you get to build your best. The rest of us, the ones who came after, the ones who will come next, we owe Gen X a debt we can never fully repay. We owe them for the music that got us through our own darkness. We owe them for the dark jokes that taught us how to laugh when crying was not an option. We owe them for raising kids who will never know what it feels like to wait alone in a parking lot at dusk, hoping someone remembers to pick them up. And most of all, we owe them for proving that damage does not have to be destiny. So the next time someone tries to tell you that Gen X is the forgotten generation, correct them. They are not forgotten. They are the ones who remembered everything, carried it alone for decades, and still managed to build a world where their own children will never have to do the same. That is not failure. That is the single greatest act of defiance I have ever witnessed. What did you think about all of this? Do you agree? Do you have your own stories that line up with what we just walked through? Or maybe some that push back? Drop them in the comments. I read every single one. And this conversation matters. Like the video, if it hit you in the chest, the way it hit me, putting it together. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And if it meant something, share it with someone who needs to hear that they were never the problem. All roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.